Hi everyone, welcome to Mums Who Code video guide session. This is a special video. We do have few of our fellow participants here who's going to learn along while we record this video. So in the previous video, what we had was we wrote a failing test and we made it pass in case if the data that we are getting or receiving from our caller to the foundation layer is null. So now we are moving on to the next set of validation. Let's assume that this data that's coming in is not null, but it's still invalid. What it means is, for example, maybe book, right? So you're building your software to get the book data from the user and then saving the data. Let's say you're collecting the book name, book author, publish date. For you to persist the data, depending on your software requirement, you'll have to decide if the book published date can be an invalid date or not, or should it be a future date or not. So these are all your business logic, right? So to understand what is the valid data that you have to receive before you're saving. So all that can be considered as invalid data based on your requirements. So in this particular example that I'm going to work on, I'm just taking a random, grid and a random text. So what my expectation is, if the grid value is empty, it's like by default 000, and if my string value is null or empty or white spaces, I want my system to reject the data and say, hey, you have provided me invalid data. Can you fix the errors? And then again, call my function to save the data. So that's it. So this diagram that I'm showing you is what we discussed when we have created our null exception, right? So whenever the caller is calling the foundation layer with the null data, the contract that I'm going to give them back is null sample exception. Now what is going to happen is if this particular exposure who's going to call the foundation layer is providing in some invalid data, that is, I'm not going to give you the book title or publish date. And in that case, what would be the contact or the contract that is going to be returned, right? Again, instead of a very generic one, we're going to localize that. So what are we going to do? We're going to say what that error is, and then we're going to say what that entity is about, right? The same way how we constructed our null sample exception. So feel free to stop me if there's something that I'm not explaining clearly or if I'm missing anything. So what's the error here? Invalid is my error. And what's the entity I'm going to work on? Sample is my entity. So now this is going to serve as my contract for anyone who's going to call this foundation add sample with an invalid data. So this is the diagram that we're working on currently. And then what we are going to see is this piece also, right? Since we are increasing the complexity, I'm moving on rather than jumping to the code here. So what we said was all the different type of validation exception are going to be grouped, are going to be categorized into one bucket. And then the inner exception will have the actual exception. So previously we prepared our null exception. In this case, what are we going to pack it up in case of invalid data is invalid sample exception. But the wrapper is still the same. It's still holding good that, it's a category of exception, which is validation errors. So that category is still holding good. So in this test case, we are going to prepare this invalid sample, and then we are going to wrap it up into the validation exception and then test our particular function. So now let's move on to the code. Okay, here we are at the code. So this is our validations.add, and we have written our null test here, right? So let's minimize this and let's write our new test. So this is going to be fact and then public for the test to execute because it should be visible. And then this is my, test type. Now what's the test name? So it should throw what it should throw. It should throw an validation exception. When should it throw an exception? On what operation should it throw an exception? So on add, then in what case should it throw validation exception in every time or for any specific case? So in this scope of test, we are going to say if sample is invalid, we're not just asking the system to throw the error. Along with that, we are asking the system to log it. So we say and log it. Okay, good. So let's go prepare our test. Given, when, then. So as I always start with the when piece. So what am I going to test? I'm going to say test my service. I'm going to, call the add with what type of data? Invalid sample, right? This is how I'm going to call. Let me prepare the invalid sample. So sample invalid sample equal, I don't want this to be null, right? So I cannot leave it empty also. Now I have to prepare something such that it becomes an invalid data. So let me go with this and see if this satisfies my need, right? So let's hit a breakpoint here. Let's execute. So go debug the test. So for this particular sample entity, I want to prepare all combination of invalid data. So my system is robust enough to handle all different type of scenarios, right? We should not assume that, our system will never receive any error data. It's not even possible and all those things. It's case on case, but this is our learning journey and we are going to build a very simple app for create, read, update, delete. So let's handle all scenarios. So let me over this. So here, if you see my ID is 0 and text is null. So ID is 0 is fine because I don't want a 0 value. So this test data is sufficient for me to perform the test. Whereas text, this, I don't want just null. I want it to throw an error if it is an empty string, just a empty string. I wanted to throw an error if it is not having any value. Let's say the user by accident just types space, space, space and goes to the next field and enters the data, right? So I want this behavior of testing or the function to handle telling, hey, if I'm receiving text as my input, I want it to have a value. I don't want it to be null. I don't want it to be empty. I don't want it to have any white space. So now this whole test has to be executed for all these 3 different test data. So these are the 3 different input the user can give. For all the 3 different inputs, I want the test to behave the same. How can we do that? Let me stop the test. So there's something that the X unit provides. Yuri? Anyone has any question? Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to know that how you got ID equal to 0.
Okay, sure. So let me, there's this Alt and F12 is the function key. Function Alt, function F12. It's not happening. Okay, let me open up the implementation. So here, this is an integer. So how C# does the default value for integer is 0, for string is null.
Oh.
Yeah. That's how 0 came in, even without me explicitly saying that ID should hold 0, right? Okay, so now what are we going to do? We're going to explicitly say, hey, that text can take in null. So inline data, this is the syntax. Null is a keyword, right? So not within quotes, so null. Okay, so not just null, I want some other thing also to be tested. So empty string, it's not null, but it's just empty. I want one more test data. Spaces, right? Just white spaces. So for all this 3 different test data, the same test has to be executed. And then all the rest of the validation that I'm performing here has to hold good. Okay. Why is this error? It says there is no matching method parameter for value. So how can this data being passed to inside this flow, right? So it has to come in as a parameter. So this one is going to be invalid text. So how do I identify all this? I'm going to test different combinations of this, right? What's the data type for this? String. That's why I'm going and saying that this test receives a parameter string data type with all these 3 different values, right? Now I've prepared my test to run 3 times with 3 different values. Now what I want to do is pass this invalid value to this one. So how can I do that? So while you're creating an object for the class, you can say text is invalid text, right? Let's run this, debug the test. So what I'm expecting is the ID to be 0 and the text to be having all these values. So I can expand it. So this is null. So this is like first time execution. Let me, okay, it has completed. It's come for the second time. Now it's taken up just the empty string, right? So the same test is executing for the second time with a second input parameter. So let me do F5. I want it to come for the third time. Now the third time, if you see, it's come with spaces. So it's taken up all the input data for every run of the test. So that's how we're going to leverage this theory and inline data to leverage the same test code for multiple test data. Okay, now we have prepared our invalid. Now we need to prepare the exception that it's going to throw, right? What type of exception it's going to throw. So I'm going to expect a invalid sample exception equal new invalid sample exception. So this is what we saw in our diagram, that the actual exception, so the innermost exception that's going to happen for this type of error is going to be invalid sample exception. So we need to create it. So we'll go under models and then add this class here. Okay, it has to be public so it can be detected. And this is of type exception. So now I need to prepare the message such that whenever the contract is being passed, the message is also there. So we need to call the base. That's the constructor of the base class. That is this exception. And then I say sample is invalid. Fix the errors and try again. Right? And since this is a method call, which is of parameter type, message is the parameter name, and the value that we are passing is not same, I'm going to alias it. Okay. And these are all just formatting. And it's detected that, it's coming from there. Okay, all good. So now I need to wrap this up. I'm going to say that this is my actual exception, but I'm going to wrap it up into the category of exceptions. So my category is expected sample validation exception to populating. So what I'm saying is this is my outer exception that I'm going to be passing, which is going to contain, which is going to wrap it up with the inner exception. That's the invalid sample exception. Okay, all good. So in the previous test, if you have seen, that's the same thing that we have done. We prepared the null, that's the invalid data, and then we prepared the expected values and all those things. Okay, now we are taking this one to the next level. Why? If you go to the sample data, right? What if the user is going to give you a valid book name, but the user is not providing you a valid author name. So in that case, you'll have to give a meaningful message, right? The book title is valid. The book author name is invalid. So you'll have to give some meaningful message so that it binds up in the UI, or while we are communicating, that exactly this is where the error has happened, right? I think most of you would have interacted with some websites where you are registering your first name, last name. I think for COVID vaccine also, right? While you're filling in the details, you would have registered it, right? So while you're registering for your COVID vaccine, you would have given your first name, last name, maybe you've entered your mobile name wrong, mobile number wrong, and then you click on submit. Just above that mobile number box, you would have received a red line, or some messaging telling the number is invalid or some kind of thing. Why didn't the whole thing fail? Why did the whole text box go red? It was just that one text box, right? So something of that sort, where you want to give error message very much specific to the field or the data in which it's invalid. So for that to happen, you need to prepare, because we are preparing all expected, right? So we are going to prepare the data such that it's only those kind of fields are coming up with those kind of messages. Okay, so what does that mean? So I'm going to say, this is my inner exception. This is going to hold some data. What type of data? It's going to hold in a mapping telling this is my field name and this is my error message, which means that for book title, title is invalid. For book author, author is invalid. So something of that sort. So this is my key. This add data takes in two parameters. One is key and then values. So key, what's the key here? Name of sample.id. This is my actual parameter name, right? Instead of me hard coding things like ID, this is more recommended because the actual property name comes from the class itself instead of, hard coding it. That's the better way. Okay. If this ID is invalid, what's the message I want to give? ID is invalid, right? Or ID is required. Whatever messaging that makes sense for you. Yeah.
Do I need to give this message because ID user not putting ID itself, right?
Yeah. So here, that's a very valid question, right? Some data inside your contract might come from the user or might come from the interim service also. So this message is going to serve as a standard message to whomsoever is going to call you. So let's say from the website, user is typing in the first name and last name, but the user is not typing in the ID, which is the unique identifier. That website has the code behind, right? So that code is reading the data, preparing the data with ID, stamping it with created by, updated by, created date, all the auditing data, and then calling the service. So as the service boundary, it just understands that, hey, I don't bother who's calling me. This is my requirement. This is my focus, that if anyone is calling me, these are the things I'm expecting. And then I throw back the error. So to your point, if there is a in-between layer who's preparing this auditing data, will take this error and display only the error that user has. If that error is coming from not because of the user, but because of that code, it will handle it and it will send it back. Things like that can happen.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a very valid question. Okay. So depending on this object, I want the ID to be there. What else I want? So I want one more, that is name of, and then sample.text. Okay. And what's the message I want to give? I can say text is required, right? So now I've prepared my expected value, not just telling that, hey, this is the contract, this is the message, but I'm taking it to one level and say where exactly this data has failed and what's the error message that it has to give so that you're prepared. Now what we need to do is to just save what it is. Okay, let me remove this. Save what it is doing and then validate things. That's all, which is same thing as this. You can just copy paste, that will work. Okay, now we are just going to write it out. So here what I'm going to do is save this one. So I'm going to say action, add sample action, and I'm going to defer the execution because right away when this line number 71 is executed, I don't want the method to be called. I want to call when I want to validate. So here I say assert dot throws, and what it should throw, sample validation exception, and I'm validating it against add sample action. Okay, now I don't want to end up here. I want to end and validate this logging also. When this error happens, I want this logging to happen. So I've explained in detail for the, whatever I'm writing here in the null code. That's why I'm not repeating it here. So if at all you forget or you're missing some connecting dots, you can go back to the null check video and verify all that. So verify broker. I'm expecting the broker to log an error and I'm going to validate if everything is same. It is same exception as. Now you actually know, since you're writing the second test case, now you'll actually, make sense. Hey, okay, why did I go and make this type as exception? Why did I move this code to a common code and all that, right? So this is going to be my expected and times once. So I want the logging to happen just once. So let me see one more here. Okay, it's happy now. There's one thing that we need to change in this call. Okay. Here. If someone can think about it. So far what we have done is this same exception as just validates messages. It validates that this message is same and the inner exception message is same. It doesn't validate this piece, which is a crucial part in this test case, right? We wanted to validate exactly that this is the field, this is the error message, this is the field, this is the error message. We want it to be one-on-one. So how can that happen? So the code for it is again ampersand ampersand because I want all the condition to be passed. So I say exception dot inner exception as exception. So I'm reading the inner exception because that invalid sample exception has that data, right? So dot data equal expect inner exception dot data. Okay. So going back here, now I'm not just validating the message, but I'm validating the data as well. What else? I want to ensure that the core logic for this particular call is insert, right? I wanted to verify even that is not being called. So even this I've explained in the null check video. Why am I going to do this? And what's the syntax of it? Times never. I don't want this call to be ever happening because the data is invalid, right? There's no point in going and calling save. Start logging broker. So we're going at level more advanced, telling that I'm not just validating that this error should be called, but none of the other calls should have happened, right? Why is the software need to do so many things when it's not required to do? So that's what we are trying to do here, that verify no other calls are being made for this broker. So here we are. Let's run the test. It should actually fail, telling that you're expecting some error to happen, but there is no error thrown because we're not even validating that scenario here. Okay, good.
Okay.
So this is our fail test. So analyze, run, code cleanup, and let me make a comment. So this will mark the end of this video. In the next video, we will look at how we can make this test pass. And even that is going to introduce some kind of new concepts. So that's why we are going to part this as two different videos. Yeah, thank you for watching. See you all in the next video.